Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Geography Podcast. Been out on the road for the last couple weeks, so I haven't gotten one of these out in a little while, but I just wanted to come out and talk a little bit about what's going on right now politically in the U.S. There's actually a lot of things going on there politically, but obviously one issue has jumped out from the headlines a lot more than the other, and I actually spent a lot of time the last couple of days getting into stupid arguments with people on the internet about it, which I, on the one hand, regret, but on the other hand, it did help clarify some things for me. So I want to talk about what's going on at the southern border of the United States right now with refugees, asylum seekers, migrants. Really, it's all of those. And what's going on with the issue with children crossing the border. So first, I want to lay out what I understand happened, and then I want to talk about why I think sort of people who are more liberal and people who are more conservative are having a very difficult time. I would say it feels impossible to even just talk to each other about it and see where the other's coming from. So I want to go into why that is. And I think it's something which is going to be relevant for thinking about a lot of other questions, really why we have so much trouble understanding each other and how a person could possibly come to the conclusions that they do that are so different from ours if they're starting from a place of goodwill, which I really, really believe that almost everybody involved is. So here we go. I want to first hit a little bit of history, a little jaunt into history. So basically what was happening 4 or 5 years ago while Obama was still president, there was a massive influx of immigrants coming into the United States, a lot more children. Used to be almost entirely, young men coming into work, but it started to be a lot more families and children, various reasons for that, which are a little beside the point for the moment. But basically what started happening was that at a certain point, the Obama administration started to more strictly enforce border control. And then they had all these families being detained who would come into the country illegally, and then when they were caught, they would claim asylum. Now, that's kind of an important point because officially asylum seekers are supposed to show up at a port of entry, which means, unofficial border crossing, and request asylum. So even if they're legitimate asylum seekers, they've still technically broken the law. And I'll get later to why that's important to some people and not important to other people. So in any case, they had broken a law and they were being caught and prosecuted, including if they had children. But the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is one of the next level up appellate courts in the United States, ruled that you couldn't keep the children in jail with their parents for more than 20 days. What do you mean you can't keep children in jail for months at a time? So after 20 days in the jail or whatever place where they were detaining the families, after 20 days, they had to send the kids somewhere else. And the idea was they were supposed to be sent off with, child services, basically. Like, for instance, if two parents are arrested in the United States, two people who are citizens, and there's no, family member nearby, no family member available to take them, they'll take them to a foster home or something. So the idea seems to be, at least on paper, that that's what's supposed to happen with these kids. But after similar things to what we're seeing now started to happen, and they got bad press, basically the Obama administration's solution was to allow people coming in with children to go free. Basically, it's what they call catch and release. They caught them, they processed they started processing them, and they let them go. And the idea being, hey, let us know where you are, and we'll call you when your court date shows up. Of course, the people, most people would never show up for the court date. They would just disappear into the massive interior of the United States, never to be seen again. And many of them, even if they were legitimate asylum seekers, might have had good reason for doing that. I'm not judging that, but that's the case. So that was the case through the end. That basically happened in 2014, 2015. And then in the last year and a half, since Trump became president, especially in the last 6 months or so, they decided to aggressively enforce the border again meaning they decided that they were no longer going to selectively allow families with children to go through without prosecuting them. They were going to stop and prosecute everybody. And that's the discretion involved that I've seen a lot of people talk about on the news. It took me a while to understand what they meant by it's a discretionary decision. This seems to be what they mean, that essentially there is some discretionary power in the executive branch on what to bother prosecuting. However, it seems that if they've decided to prosecute these parents and keep them in jail, they are required to remove the children. So the solution, with the law written as it is now, the solution is either to just let them go or to keep them in jail and then take the children after 20 days, because it takes longer than that to process asylum applications. Because it's partly because of a lack of staff, and partly also just because it's very hard and takes a long time to try to figure out if a person's a legitimate asylum seeker or not. So from the perspective of Trump's people who have been representing him on, TV and whatever, including him, it seems that some of the people in the administration see this issue with separating children from their parents as a deterrent, which, they're not against, that they support, which I think is very difficult to make a legitimate argument for. Although I do understand it would be a deterrent, but I don't think it's a moral one. And then other members of the administration see it as an unfortunate byproduct of enforcing border security. And there's kind of a vagueness around it because it's not really clear which of those is the administration's perspective. But I want to put the messaging of the administration aside a little bit and talk about why in the continuation of this podcast, I'm going to talk more about why it is that normal people support one or the other side of this. So for the moment, I'm just going to focus on people who believe it's, an unfortunate byproduct of enforcing border security. And that happens to be over 90% of the American people in both parties who agree that the children should stay with their parents. But they have different ideas about what to do about it. Conservatives think that it needs to be solved in a way that you can still continue to arrest and prosecute aggressively everyone who crosses the border illegally. And that's why they want to do it by passing a law. They want to pass a law that says this is the way we're going to deal with this, and also, gives more money to certain things so they can speed up the process, etc. And liberals seem to want to go back to catch and release, which is definitely a quicker fix because it could happen like that, with a snap of a finger. And obviously, conservatives think that that's no solution. So even though almost everybody thinks the current situation is terrible, they can't agree on what to do about it. Why is that? So how can anyone see it differently, right? Whichever side of this you are on, it probably is incomprehensible to you that someone else could, in good faith, with, strong moral conscience, see it the other way. And how could that be? So, I want to tell you how. So, I think the best book that addresses this, at least that I know of, it's a book by Jonathan Haidt. His last name spelled Haidt. And the book is called The Righteous Mind. It's available on Amazon. It's available as an audiobook. It's available on Kindle. I read it as an audiobook. And basically, Jonathan Haidt is a, social science researcher. And he has helped develop this theory, which was put out by other people, but he's helped to develop it and popularize it, of these sort of 5 basic categories of moral intuitions. He calls it moral foundations theory. 5 basic categories of moral intuitions, which are held across societies around the world. They've done questionnaires all over the world, and they found that these same sort of 5 basic categories apply in these different societies, but they are not distributed evenly among the people in each country. Those 5 things are care, as in caring for people who need it, fairness and proportionality, in-group loyalty, respect for what one sees as legitimate authority, and sanctity and purity, sanctity or / purity. So care, fairness, loyalty, respect, and sanctity. Now, these are the colors that are available for our moral palettes. But liberals and conservatives have different palettes. It seems that for the most part, and this is according to Haidt's studies, liberals care a lot about care and fairness, the first two, but they care very little for loyalty, authority, or sanctity, the other three foundations. They see those as either illegitimate sources for moral reasoning or just plain downright immoral in and of themselves to involve in one's decision making. Whereas conservatives use all five of these areas, and the most conservative members of all the societies surveyed by Haidt, they gave each of the five foundations almost similar weight, meaning those bottom three, they come up to the middle of the graph and meet the top two that come down, and there's a relatively similar weight given to all five categories, as opposed to the most liberal members of the society, where those first two are up at the top of the graph and the other three are way down at the bottom, far apart. So we're going to apply this to our current situation, all right? We've got our liberal moral palette, which is very clear, but relatively narrow. And we've got the conservative moral palette, which is broader, but then, of course, that makes some of the calculations a little more difficult and complicated. So if I'm very liberal, that means I probably look at what's going on and I see that something unfair is happening, right? These people just want a better life, something I also want, and I have no right to deny it to them. That would be unfair. That is against one of the two core moral intuitions that I have as a liberal-leaning human being. And because it's unfair, and because this is happening to people, I have a duty to care for them, which is the other of the two. So, or perhaps even if it wasn't unfair, I would have that duty. And there's nothing mitigating that, meaning those two moral injunctions are clear as day, and there's no competing moral claim to them. Now, it may surprise some people on the liberal end to know that conservatives also have those same intuitions. They also see that it's unfair, and they also see that these people need care. But they also have they also value these three other sort of colors on the palette. They also value loyalty to an in-group over out-group members, which means they think they do have a right to treat people who are not U.S. citizens different from U.S. citizens, and they don't think they have an equal responsibility toward them as to people in their own society. In Judaism, we call this, there's a principle that you should take care of the poor of your city first. There is an idea that our moral, what's required of us morally is more, the closer to us it is. We're not responsible for all the suffering in the world equally, right? We have to take care of our own poor first before we take care of the poor in other places. Of course, how you apply that will vary greatly depending on where you fall on this left-right moral intuition spectrum. So another issue that conservatives have that liberals don't is respect for authority. So on the one hand, you might say, well, authority in and of itself is not a moral fact. Just because something has authority doesn't mean it's right. That's true, but obviously this is only something which is seen as a legitimate authority. So usually conservatives see their state institutions, especially in democratic countries, as being legitimate authorities, and that if someone wants to change something, the only way to do it legitimately is through that system, meaning rebelling against the authority is so dangerous, and they're so afraid of anarchy and that they want to hold on to established order, even if not all of the outcomes of that are things they would like. They see order and tradition as things that are very delicate balances that are easy to destroy and hard to build. So they're much more afraid of anarchy, whereas people who are more on the liberal side of the spectrum would tend to see a more anarchic situation as a sort of an opportunity, right? As Silicon Valley, people would say you're disrupting, right? They say that as a good thing. More conservative people see that as a bad thing. So thus their the preference of these conservatives is to work the issue out through passing a new law, and because they think that protecting your in-group, American citizens, from what they see as a threat in whatever way is a legitimate thing to feel to start. And then you can argue whether they're right or wrong that it is a threat, but they feel that is a legitimate feeling to have. And liberals tend not to think that that's legit. Also, just the idea of doing things through the authority, the sort of proper authorities, is seen as a moral value by conservatives, whereas for liberals, it's largely not. So they're less constrained by that. So let me summarize here. In short, when a liberal person sees these people suffering, trying to come across the border, it seems like it's happening for no good reason, because the moral arguments for strict border enforcement only really make sense in a conservative moral matrix, is how Haidt describes it. So thus, there is no excuse for these bad outcomes, the separating of the kids from their parents. There's no excuse for it because there's really no morally justifiable aim being served by arresting and prosecuting the parents in the first place from this view. Or at the very least, they might recognize it, but it's a very weak good. Conservatives see the border enforcement itself as morally necessary, and therefore they see the bad, and certainly justifiable, even if not necessary, and therefore they see the bad outcome of separating children from their parents as the negative side effect of an otherwise good policy. It's strict enforcement, right? So they want to ameliorate the worst consequences of the policy, but they refuse to catch and release. They refuse to let people off the hook because they see that in and of itself as immoral. They see not punishing wrongdoers as immoral. And they see any breaking of the law as immoral. So they see crossing the border illegally as immoral. And therefore, because these people have essentially disrespected our group, which is us, the people of the United States, or you, I should say, and quote unquote, our laws and our authority. And at the very least, these people shouldn't be allowed in, whereas liberals feel that we owe them more for the sake of fairness. We owe them more than just judging them strictly based on these laws. And therefore, what right do we have to refuse to help them if they ask for it? So I hope this clarifies things a bit. I clearly fall more on the conservative side of this, so I apologize if I've unintentionally caricatured the liberal view, but I think I gave both sides a fair shake here. And I hope that's clarifying, because I really think this is often the problem in almost every political issue, where we just can't really talk to each other because we just don't even see the same things. We're looking at the world through prisms with different chemical makeup, and we're seeing different pictures on the other end. Now, that's all I have to say about the issue itself. But I want to go into one other thing, which is secondary, and this is just about the way people are talking about this. And the issue is Nazis. This drives me nuts. A lot of pundits have been really quick to jump to the comparison between what's happening now in the United States and the Nazis. As my wife says, until they are tearing babies from their mother's arms and throwing them alive into a pit full of burning bodies, don't talk to me about Nazis. Not all bad things are the same, and the comparison with Nazis just makes you sound detached from reality. I'm not asking you to stop because it bothers me, although it does. I'm asking you to stop comparing what Trump's doing to the Nazis, or the US government is doing to the Nazis, because it doesn't work as a comparison and it makes you sound stupid and ignorant. All right? Now, it could be that the main reason everybody jumps to Nazis as their basis for comparison on almost any issue where they don't like what the government's doing, if there's any human cost at all to anyone, we jump straight to Nazis. Maybe it's because it's the only sort of big historical evil many of these people are aware of. Or in the case of journalists, maybe, the only comparison that they think their public, the people listening, are aware of. So allow me to offer a handful of different and still imperfect, but at least sort of closer to the mark comparisons. These are just a few that came to me off the top of my head. I didn't, do deep research on it to come up with more. I'm sure I could have come up with a list of 10 or 20 such examples. These are just the ones that came to me the quickest. One example is that in the 1800s, there was a movement by a bunch of probably for the most part well-meaning sort of white Christian missionaries who took Native American children from their families. It wasn't done by force, so maybe it's not a perfect analogy, but essentially these kids were taken away and put in boarding schools where they were not allowed to speak their native languages. They were forced to speak English. They were taught Christianity. Their traditional religious beliefs were pushed off to the side and delegitimized. Maybe that's a sort of a good analogy in some ways. Also, the rabbit-proof fence in Australia, where Aboriginal children were kept separate from their families in a somewhat similar situation. And finally, how about the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II? It's not quite the same because in that case they were U.S. citizens, although according to what I just said, that should only really matter to conservatives, not to liberals, but still, just for the sake of accuracy, it's not quite the same because of that. And also families were not separated in that case. But still, you're taking people and you're putting them in something that looks like a camp of some sort where they're being held, basically a giant jail. And there's some similarity in that, and that it was unjust. If you're one of those people making the argument that this whole thing is unjust, that was clearly a case of unjust internment of people, and I think that could serve your rhetorical purposes very well. I think even probably most Americans are aware enough that happened that it would be a meaningful comparison to make, and it actually is like on the scale and type of evil of the kind of thing that you perceive what's going on now to be. As opposed to what the Nazi intentional eradication of a whole group of people from the planet Earth by murdering them as viciously as possible, sometimes more viciously than necessary just for sport, throwing people, throwing babies and shooting them for fun, lighting huge piles of corpses on fire and pushing living people on top of it to burn to death, things like that. That was Nazis. So I just want to clarify why that's not a good comparison. And because I understand there are people of goodwill who are morally outraged. And so when you're morally outraged, you want to jump to the strongest possible comparison. But that only really works with people who already agree with you. Everyone, even if they're kind of on the fence, about the issue, it just turns them off and makes them think you're nuts. So for your own sake and for mine, please, steer a little bit more clear of the Nazi comparison. I would really appreciate it. And so would, the 6 million people, 6 million Jews murdered by Hitler, no doubt appreciate it if you gave a little bit more respect to, what was unique about their experience. So thanks for listening. This has been the Jewish Geography Podcast. If you like what you hear here, you can go to patreon.com/Rabbi Eitan and give a little monthly support. That would be great. The more support I get, the more I can do this. I can set time aside for it, get better recording equipment, etc., and distribute it more widely. If you would like to see other things that I'm up to, me, Rabbi Eitan, you can go to rabbieitan.com, RABBIEITAN, and there's links to everything I'm up to on there, including, I think, possibly most importantly, sign up for my email list. If you sign up there, you'll get updates on any articles I put out, special tours that I'm offering, and of course, podcasts like this one as they come out. So please go to rabbieitan.com and check that out. In the meantime, thank you for listening. I hope that everything works out for the good, please God, and that we will all find it in our hearts to view each other as, complex people with our own reasons for doing what we're doing, especially because we're trying to live together peacefully in the same societies. And God bless you. Take care.